Guys, it's Mandy. Welcome to my channel. So in my opinion, one of the most important pieces of information you can get on a prospective tenant is their current and previous landlord references. I want to talk about the importance of these references, what types of questions you should be asking to the landlord when you do call and talk to them, and also how to make sure you're not getting scammed by the tenant. It's possible that the tenant could provide false information in their application and give you a false name like a parent or a friend, someone who's obviously going to say great things about them, instead of their actual landlord. And there's a few ways that you can try to minimize and make sure that this isn't happening to you. To rent one of my properties, I require that you have a previous or current landlord reference, preferably both, but at least a current landlord reference. The reason that I require this is because I found that you can really learn a lot about a tenant from that reference, and without it, you're almost kind of missing a piece of the puzzle. So I found that when a tenant has just a stellar reference, the landlord says they never paid rent late, they took great care of the property, they were no trouble at all, that's how they're going to be for me. They're going to be good tenants. But I've also found that if the reference is just so-so, like, yeah, they paid their rent on time, but there were a few little things, or if they don't have a reference at all, then I have like a 50-50 chance of getting a good tenant or a not so good tenant. And I would prefer to just not take that chance. So I want to see that all of my tenants have a really excellent reference from their past landlord. Now, that requirement may not work out for everybody. Maybe you target college students and it doesn't make sense to have that requirement because a lot of college students don't have a landlord reference. Maybe they're just moving out from the house with mom and dad and this is their first time renting. Or maybe you live in a city where there's more competition and you don't want to put such strict requirements that it makes it hard to rent out your house. So you just have to find what works best for you and what gets a good quality tenant into your property. I will add that I do have one exception to the rule that they have to have a landlord reference, and that exception is if they have been homeowners. And I don't just mean they owned a house for 1 year, so now they don't have to have a reference. I mean, if the reason that they cannot provide a landlord reference is because they haven't rented, they've just owned a home, then I'm not going to hold that against them. A lot of times you can find a picture of the house that they own. Like most of the time, the house will either be listed currently or they will have just sold it, and that's why they're looking for a house to rent. So in those cases, you can find the listing for their property on Zillow or Realtor.com, and you can look at the listing pictures and read the description and see how well they took care of that property when they lived there. And that will give you a good idea of how they will take care of your property. And I will say that all of the tenants that I've rented to that have also been previous homeowners, they've all been really excellent tenants. Okay, so how can you verify that the information that the tenant provided on their application is correct and that you're not being scammed? So what you're going to do is if the reference that they provided you is a property management company, then you can be, pretty sure that that's not a scam. You can verify that the number that they gave you actually is the number for the property management company, and you should be good to go. So you don't really have to worry about any of these next steps. But if they give you a private landlord name and a private landlord number, then the first thing you're going to do is just Google that landlord's name and see if you can find his phone number out there anywhere. And if you are able to find his phone number, it should match the phone number they gave you. And if it doesn't, I would just tell you to call that phone number that you found online first. It could be an old, outdated number, but the worst that's going to happen is somebody's just going to tell you it's the wrong number. If you can't find anything about the landlord from Google, then I would go take it to Facebook and I would try to find their profile. If you're able to find their profile, you can message them on Facebook. I've actually had a landlord message me on Facebook, and I thought that was a really good idea because she knows it's me. I don't think somebody's going to go through the trouble to create a fake profile. So she knew it was me, and we were able to communicate via Facebook, and that worked out well. I will say that unless you're friends with the person already, they may not see your message. I find that Facebook, the notifications, depending on if you use your phone or the computer, it's not always clear that you have a message request from someone who's not your friend. So they may not see the message you sent until it's too late. It's not as timely as if you're just to give them a phone call, right? If you are unable to find the landlord by Googling them or on Facebook, then there still is some information that you can verify. So on the application that the tenant filled out, you should have asked for the address of the property that they are renting. You want to go onto the county assessor's website where that property is located. If you are unfamiliar on how to use the county assessor's website, then I do have another video that goes into more detail on that, and I'll link it down below. It's actually really, really useful information to have if you are into real estate at all. So one thing that will be listed on the county assessor's website is the name of the property owner. You want to verify that this matches the landlord's name that they provided on their rental application. If it doesn't match, there's very little times that it would make sense for it not to match. Like possibly there's a different property manager than is the owner of the property. That could be the case, but it's pretty unlikely, especially if it's a private landlord and it's not like a big property management company. The other exception would be if the property is owned by an LLC or an S Corp. And you can actually verify like who the president of the S Corp is or who the owner of the LLC is. You can do that on your state secretary page. So that's public information as well. And you can actually verify that the tenant was living at that address most of the time. It may not always be there, but if they live there, especially for several years, then their car should be registered at that address, and their personal property taxes, you can see if they were paying them or not, they should also be registered at that address. It should have their name and whether or not they paid their personal property tax. And that will give you an idea of how long they lived there, assuming that their car was registered at that address. Now, what questions should you be asking the landlord? And don't worry, if you were unable to verify that the landlord is who the tenant said they are, up until this point, there are some questions and some ways that you can word the questions that you ask the landlord to get a feel for if it's actually a real landlord or if it's someone who is just a friend to the tenant. So one thing that you should do is that you should phrase the questions in a way that would be difficult for someone who wasn't actually the previous landlord to answer. And one way to do this, instead of just asking them to verify the information that you give them, like for example saying, so they were paying $850 a month in rent, you would ask the landlord how much were they paying each month in rent, and then the landlord would have to tell you that information. So the rent one is an easier example, but there are other harder questions as well. So I'm just going to go through a list of questions that I ask when I talk to another landlord on the phone. Do you mind to verify the address of the property that they were renting from you? What was the amount of rent that they were paying each month? How long did they rent from you? How many times did they pay rent late? Did they take good care of the property? Did you have any issues with them breaking the lease? Did they give you proper notice when they moved out? Do you know why they moved? When they moved out, how much work was required to get it ready for the next tenant? If given the opportunity, would you rent to this tenant again? Is there anything else I should know about this tenant? So that's a lot of questions, and I wouldn't always ask every single question. It kind of just depends how forthcoming the landlord is. Sometimes you almost don't have to ask any questions. The landlord's just happy to tell you everything they know about the tenant. And sometimes they're a little more reserved, especially if it's a property management company. I found a lot of times the property management companies don't volunteer a lot of extra information, so you really do have to ask your questions. And some property management companies are more inclined to just give yes or no answers, so you may need to phrase your questions a little differently if that's the case. So as I was editing the video, I realized that I forgot to discuss one important differentiation. Up until this point, I have been using the terms current landlord and previous landlord interchangeably. I've been basically just meaning a landlord reference in general. However, a current landlord reference and a previous landlord reference are not equal. If I can get a previous landlord reference, I always prefer to have that over the current landlord reference. And the reason for that is that the previous landlord has absolutely no reason to lie to you. And in fact, you'll find that if they did have a bad experience with the tenant, then they're more than happy to share and to tell you all about it and give you all the little tiny details. But the current landlord doesn't have the same interest that you do. They're trying to protect their property and their income, and you're trying to protect your property. So if the tenant does happen to be a bad tenant, one of the best things that can happen for that landlord is for them to get rid of the tenant. And one way that they can do that is by pawning the tenant off on you. So I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't use current landlord references. They can still be very valuable. I'm just saying that maybe you should put a little less weight into them than if you had a previous landlord reference, and maybe take them with a grain of salt. Understand that it can't be the only thing you go off of. You have to look at some other factors as well, and it's just one piece of the picture of the tenant. Anyway, that's all I have for you guys. I hope that you found this video valuable. I'm sure there's some things that I've missed though, so if some of you seasoned landlords have some tips, I would love for you to put them in the comments. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.